In early April 2021 in Houston, Texas, home to the second largest Vietnamese American community in the United States, a Vietnamese woman named Lien posted an unusual status on Facebook. Those words seemed like a silent cry for help. "If suddenly no one can find me, or if I'm found dead, please check my husband." To those who read it, this might have seemed like a joke or the kind of dramatic statement that comes up during marital disputes. But few could have imagined that this would prove to be a haunting prophecy of the tragedy about to unfold. Lien Chi's aunt, Simon Lei, who maintained regular contact with her niece, was the first to notice something was wrong. The weekly phone calls suddenly stopped, and messages went unanswered. Simon tried to recall their last conversation. Lien Chi had seemed exhausted and anxious. Something wasn't right in her marriage, but Lien Chi remained hesitant, not yet ready to share all her secrets. As April drew to a close with still no word from her niece, Simon's uneasiness grew stronger. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. It was time to act. On April 28, 2021, with mounting anxiety, Simon Liu decided to contact the Harris County Police Department. Her voice trembled as she reported the unusual loss of contact with her niece over several weeks. The officers who received the report recognized the seriousness of the situation and quickly dispatched a patrol unit to investigate. That afternoon, there was a knock at the door of the house in northwest Houston where Lien Chi and her husband lived. However, when the door opened, the officers were surprised to face a completely unfamiliar woman. This woman introduced herself as the ex-wife of Curtis Holliday, Lien Chi's husband. Notably, she was holding a 4-year-old girl, who was Curtis and Lien Chi's daughter. When asked about Lien Chi's whereabouts, the ex-wife's eyes showed confusion and uncertainty. She awkwardly explained that Curtis had asked her to watch the child for a while, saying that Lien Chi had to go away to handle personal matters. However, this vague and unconvincing answer raised suspicions in the officers' minds. A natural question arose. What mother would leave her young child with her husband's ex-wife without a valid reason? The obvious absurdity of this situation triggered the investigators' professional instincts. They clearly sensed that something was wrong. Information was immediately relayed back to the police station, and a professional investigation team was deployed to delve deeper into this mysterious disappearance. All these details pointed to a troubling conclusion. This was not a planned departure. If Lien Chi had actually decided to leave her family, why would she leave behind all her most essential belongings? Why wouldn't she take her car? These questions only deepened the investigators' suspicions. The investigation expanded to the surrounding neighborhood. When questioned, neighbors all expressed surprise and concern upon learning of Lien Chi's disappearance. They recalled the last moments they saw her, around early April, when she still appeared normally in the neighborhood. Notably, no one had ever heard any arguments or disputes from the couple's house. No unusual sounds or suspicious events were recorded at that time. Meanwhile, the ex-wife's testimony made the situation even more complex and questionable. According to her, a few weeks earlier, Curtis had called with a worried tone, asking her to help care for their young daughter. The reason he gave was that Lien Chi had left home, and he was too busy with his business. However, this explanation raised even more important questions. Why would a husband not report to police when his wife mysteriously disappeared? If he was truly worried about his wife, why didn't Curtis try to contact her family in Vietnam or close friends? And especially, why did he decide to entrust their child to his ex-wife? Recognizing the growing contradictions and doubts, the investigation team decided to dig deeper into this family's past and background. They began examining population records, learning about the relationship between Lien Chi and Curtis, as well as any incidents that might have occurred in their marriage. The missing person was identified as Lathy Lien Chi, a young woman born in 1990 in Vietnam from a middle-class family. Her life took a fateful turn in 2015 when, through the WeChat app, Lien Chi met Curtis Allen Holliday. From their first glimpse through the screen, the contrast between these two people was stark. Curtis, born in 1961, was already 54 when they met, 29 years older than Lien Chi, nearly a generation apart. He possessed a tall, imposing stature with a calm demeanor bearing the marks of years of experience. Curtis was born and raised in Texas and had served in the military in his youth. After his military service, Curtis turned to entrepreneurship. In Lien Chi's eyes, Curtis appeared as an ideal model of success. He owned a family business specializing in discounted household goods, had a stable income, and owned a house in Houston. Although she knew Curtis had been through a previous marriage and recognized the significant age gap between them, Lien Chi didn't mind. This cross-border romance began with sweet messages, hours-long video calls, and ultimately the bold decision of a young woman, leaving everything familiar behind to step into a completely new life with a man nearly 3 decades her senior. Soon after, she moved into his house in suburban Houston and began helping manage the business. The future of the couple in the discounted household goods business seemed very promising, and Lien Chi quickly demonstrated her resourcefulness and acuity in supporting the work. Friends said she learned English very quickly and adapted well to her new life. In 2016, Lien Chi gave birth to a lovely baby girl for Curtis. At 25, in a foreign land, she devoted all her love to her child, nurturing hopes for a happy home. By 2019, she officially married Curtis to stabilize their family life. Facebook photos from that time were filled with happy moments. Some online friends even expressed admiration, saying she was very lucky. However, what appeared on the surface was only the tip of a massive iceberg. When investigators dug deeper into Curtis Holliday's actual life, a completely different portrait began to emerge. Those who had the opportunity to interact closely with Curtis all described him as someone with a tendency to manipulate others in subtle ways, with a hot temper and unpredictable nature. Especially in his relationship with Lien Chi, Curtis clearly displayed toxic thinking, viewing his wife as personal property rather than an equal partner deserving respect. This became particularly dangerous considering Lien Chi's special circumstances. As a new immigrant, she was completely dependent on Curtis economically, legally, and socially. She had no independent support network, no personal income. This imbalance could have created an environment conducive to control and manipulation. Now, with Lien Chi having mysteriously disappeared, especially right after posting that cryptic cry for help on Facebook, all these pieces began forming a terrifying picture. The investigators' professional instincts recognized that some terrible secret was hidden behind this disappearance. The team of officers assigned to examine the scene conducted a meticulous search of Lien Chi and her husband's house. They found the house very clean. No bloodstains were discovered, no signs of fights or physical conflicts visible to the naked eye. But this very perfection made the investigators even more suspicious. It was possible that a crime had actually occurred here, but had been covered up by a professional cleanup operation. With caution and professionalism, the investigators decided to collect items that might contain important clues, carefully packaging them for forensic laboratory testing. Meanwhile, Curtis Allen Holliday was also summoned for questioning. After reviewing preliminary information, police realized that Curtis Holliday wasn't present at the house when police came to check, because he was required to comply with a strict restraining order issued by the court. Previously, he had been charged with domestic violence, and the court had to intervene by issuing an order prohibiting all forms of contact between Curtis and his wife. However, instead of easing suspicions, this information only thickened police doubts. If Curtis was prohibited from contacting his wife, how could he know that Lien Chi had left to be able to inform his ex-wife to care for their child? This contradiction was like a puzzle piece that didn't fit in the story Curtis had told. Specifically, Curtis hadn't just violated the restraining order once, but had reoffended. Just a few months after the first order, he had attempted to contact Lien Chi, leading to his second arrest on May 5, 2021. This meant Curtis was imprisoned 1 month after Lien Chi disappeared in early April. This coincidence couldn't be just chance. It seemed he had violated the restraining order during the most critical time period, precisely when his wife disappeared. The investigation had now shifted from an ordinary missing person search to a murder investigation. An unexpected advantage in this difficult situation was that Curtis was in custody. This meant investigators could conduct a comprehensive search of all assets related to him without worrying about obstruction, concealment, or destruction of evidence. They could freely investigate his house, business premises, vehicles, and any other property Curtis might have used to hide his crime. First, the investigation team quickly focused on his business premises. This location was at 5800 West Sam Houston Parkway, North Houston, including a large warehouse and store, where Curtis and his wife had worked daily. On May 6, 2021, with a court-approved search warrant, the team of police and forensic experts conducted an organized raid on this business premises. Tension filled the air as they entered the large space designed for storing merchandise. The scene inside initially looked normal for a typical warehouse. Everywhere were stacked boxes, household goods arranged by category, creating a maze of discounted items that Curtis dealt in. But within this normalcy, an unusual detail caught the attention of an experienced investigator. Among the piles of old merchandise, a large freezer sat conspicuously in the center of the warehouse. What made it stand out wasn't its size or location, but its complete contrast with the surrounding environment. This freezer was still brand new, its surface shiny and unblemished, unlike the other dusty, worn items in the warehouse. It was like a clear sign of recent purchase, completely inconsistent with the context of a warehouse that had existed for many years. Why would a business dealing in discounted household goods have a completely new freezer that wasn't for sale? This anomaly was too obvious to ignore. With the caution of professionals, they slowly approached the freezer. The tense moment had arrived. One of the investigators took a deep breath, mentally preparing for what might appear. Trembling fingers slowly lifted the freezer lid, and what they discovered inside left everyone standing in shocked silence. Inside the freezer, hidden under a layer of bitter cold frost, was the body of a young woman. The body had been carefully wrapped in multiple layers of plastic. The sub-zero temperature had completely frozen the corpse, and a thin layer of frost covered the skin that had turned the pale color of death. Although the victim's face was partially distorted due to the extremely low temperature effects, the identifying features were still clear enough for investigators to determine. It was indeed Lien, the woman they had been searching for. Everyone at the scene fell silent for several seconds. Immediately, the area was sealed off, and forensic technicians began photographing and collecting evidence. The freezer now became crucial evidence, carefully sealed for transport to aid the investigation. The forensic team from the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences was also urgently mobilized to conduct examinations the same day. Initially, they confirmed this was a homicide, not an accident or natural death. However, determining the exact cause proved extremely difficult. The body had been frozen. Soft tissue evidence was distorted. The forensic pathologist found no characteristic fatal wounds, nor signs of poisoning in tests. Only a few light bruises scattered on the body suggested the victim might have been suffocated to death. Ultimately, forensics concluded the cause of death could not be determined absolutely. But based on context and clinical signs, they classified this as a premeditated murder. While the forensic team focused on examining the body, other investigators began collecting evidence against Curtis. Reviewing Curtis's financial records and purchase history yielded surprising results. Hidden in the pile of transaction documents, they discovered a receipt for purchasing a large freezer, recorded on April 4, 2021. Just one day after Lien was last seen, Curtis had bought exactly the item that was later used to conceal his wife's body. As if he had planned it beforehand, or at least had acted very quickly after committing the crime. Police quickly contacted the appliance store where Curtis bought the freezer and requested to review security cameras. The CCTV footage provided irrefutable visual evidence. In the somewhat blurry black and white video, Curtis Holliday's image appeared clearly. He stood alone next to the brand new freezer, then personally pushed it onto his truck. No one helped him. Nothing suggested this was a normal shopping transaction. Instead, everything bore the mark of haste and clear purpose. This evidence was more valuable than gold for the investigation. It not only proved Curtis had bought the freezer, but also showed purposeful preparatory behavior right after his wife disappeared. This wasn't the action of a worried husband looking for his wife, but of someone who knew exactly what had happened and was trying to cover up the crime. Subsequently, mobile data specialists were deployed to analyze the digital traces that Curtis and Lien Chi had left behind. They requested telecommunications companies provide location data from cell towers, tracking the movement of both phones during the critical days. The analysis results revealed a notable detail. On the evening of April 3, 2021, signals from both phones appeared at the same location, Curtis's business premises. This proved that both husband and wife were present at the warehouse at the crucial time. But what was more frightening was that after that point, Lien Chi's phone completely stopped transmitting signals. No calls were made, no messages sent, no signs of activity from her device. This piece fit perfectly with the hypothesis the investigators were building. Curtis had lured or forced Lien Chi to come to the warehouse that fateful evening. That might have been where the final argument took place, where Curtis killed his wife. And then, to cover up the crime, he bought the freezer the next day to preserve and hide the body. Another crucial piece of evidence was the Facebook status that Lien Chi's aunt had provided. Investigators obtained the original message written by Lien Chi herself, which in English read, "My name is Lien Chi. If suddenly no one can find me or if I'm found dead, please check my husband. He has threatened to kill me many times, especially during this time when we're getting divorced." The message Lien Chi wrote was like a precautionary will in case something terrible happened. She even clearly recorded her full name, birth date, Houston address, and her husband's name as well as their daughter's name for identification evidence. This was nothing less than an accusation before her death, showing she was very afraid Curtis would harm her when she decided to divorce. On the other hand, police also collected testimony from those around them. A witness said they last saw Lien Chi on April 3, 2021. This detail was consistent with the hypothesis that Curtis arranged to meet his wife at the store to talk and then killed her. Curtis's ex-wife testified that around early April, Curtis suddenly contacted her asking her to care for their child because Lien Chi had left home with someone else. This further revealed Curtis's efforts to cover up after his wife's disappearance. During the investigation, police also considered whether there were accomplices. Curtis's ex-wife, although it seemed unusual that she helped without questioning her ex-husband, there was no evidence showing she participated in the crime. Other people like store employees or the victim's friends were not involved at all. All investigation leads now pointed to one conclusion. Curtis Allen Holliday was the one responsible. Throughout this period, Curtis was held without bail for violating the previous court order. In prison, initially he stubbornly refused to confess, insisting on his innocence and expressing concern for his wife's disappearance. But when police announced they had found Lien Chi, Curtis changed his attitude. He broke down in a fake manner and presented a new story that Lien Chi had committed suicide and he had discovered her at the warehouse and panicked, hiding her in the freezer. However, investigators couldn't be easily fooled like that. Even without this unbelievable story, the evidence against him was already overwhelming. From the clues collected along with witness testimony, police not only broke down Curtis's defensive tone, but also reconstructed the entire process of his crime. On April 3, 2021, Lien Chi woke up and prepared breakfast for her young child. She decided that today she would clearly state her intention to divorce her husband, but before acting, she took the opportunity to write a Facebook status as a cry for help that would later become a haunting final message. Around noon, Curtis called Lien Chi. She bluntly said she wanted a divorce, even pretending to say she had someone else so Curtis would let her go. But he flew into a jealous rage, screaming into the phone and threatening that he wouldn't leave her alone if she left him. Afraid the neighbors would hear, Lien Chi hung up. After that, she contacted Aunt Simon, hinting that the situation was very bad and maybe she had to leave home for a while. Simon advised her to immediately report to police if Curtis threatened her life, but Lien Chi hesitated. She knew Curtis was about to appear in court for the previous assault case, and if she reported now, it might make things more complicated. She planned to wait a few more days before leaving home with her daughter. That afternoon, Curtis was still nursing his furious anger. He had thought of a plan, and called asking his wife to come to the warehouse to talk definitively. Lien Chi, with her trusting nature and wanting to resolve things peacefully, agreed to meet at the store. Late on the evening of April 3rd, Lien Chi drove to the warehouse. The warehouse area was quiet under pale neon lights, the roll-up door half closed. Curtis was already waiting inside. Lien Chi was quite worried at this point, but she took a deep breath and decided to face it. Inside, Curtis sat in a corner of the storage room, surrounded by high stacks of merchandise boxes. He glared at his wife, then slammed the warehouse door shut, beginning to interrogate her with threats about whether her wanting to divorce him to go with someone else was true. Lien Chi barely had time to explain before being physically attacked by him, dazed and falling onto the concrete floor. In his frenzy, Curtis grabbed Lien Chi tightly, trying to suffocate her. The poor wife struggled weakly, tears streaming down. She clawed at his hands, but it was useless. A moment later, Lien Chi's body went limp and motionless on the floor. Curtis released his hands, breathing heavily. In the silent warehouse, the man stood dazed for several minutes beside his wife's body. The blind rage gradually faded, giving way to fear. He began to worry, pacing back and forth. In Curtis's head now was only the thought of how to escape punishment. Very quickly after that, Curtis decided he had to dispose of his wife's body to cover up the crime. He dragged Lien Chi to a corner of the warehouse room because he was afraid someone might accidentally walk in. He temporarily pushed her into a large cardboard box, then locked the warehouse door, quickly driving away. That night, Curtis drove to a 24-hour appliance store. He immediately bought a large new freezer, the type of chest freezer typically used to store frozen food in stores. Returning to the store warehouse near dawn, Curtis again pulled his wife out, wrapped her in multiple layers of plastic and duct tape around her body to limit the smell. He plugged in the freezer, set the temperature to the lowest level, then placed her inside the freezer. Without a hint of remorse, Curtis slammed the freezer lid shut and locked it. He pushed the freezer containing the body to the middle of the warehouse to blend in with other items. Although he knew placing it in the middle of the room was too obvious, Curtis couldn't push it further because the freezer was quite heavy. He had to leave it there and stacked some merchandise boxes around it to partially conceal it. In the following days, Curtis began his act. He contacted his ex-wife, making up a story that Lien Chi had left and asking her to watch their child. Curtis also lied to several friends saying his wife had returned to Vietnam urgently due to family matters, trying to create the appearance that Lien Chi had voluntarily left home. He still opened the store normally, selling merchandise alone. When regular customers came asking, Curtis smiled weakly, saying his wife had gone to get merchandise. Curtis planned to temporarily keep the body at the warehouse for a while, then find an opportunity to dispose of it more thoroughly, but he had misjudged the sensitivity of those who truly loved Lien Chi. Right at the end of April, Aunt Simon had sensed something abnormal and reported to police. Curtis's plan began to collapse. On May 5th, when police came to the house looking, Curtis frantically made up stories about Lien Chi leaving home. But the arrest warrant for violating the restraining order immediately followed. He was handcuffed and taken away. In his head, still not knowing how much police suspected, with no one having found his wife's body, Curtis still believed he had a chance to deny guilt. Moreover, he also planned that if the body was found, he would say that on that evening Lien Chi came to the warehouse and had committed suicide. He accidentally discovered her, was too afraid of trouble due to the restraining order, so he hid her in the freezer. However, his lies collapsed before the evidence police found. In the end, he still had to pay for his crime. In July 2021, based on all collected evidence, Curtis Allen Holliday was charged with first-degree murder. The Harris County Grand Jury heard the evidence presentation and unanimously approved the indictment on July 14, 2021. Curtis was transferred to a detention center with a no-bail order due to the serious nature of this case. The case moved into the criminal prosecution phase, beginning the journey to seek justice for Lien Chi. However, the road ahead still held many challenges as the perpetrator intended to evade and hired skilled lawyers for defense. In summer 2024, Nearly 4 years after the crime occurred, the case was finally brought to trial. Prosecutor Lindsay Bondurant and her team had collected complete evidence for conviction, ready to go to court to prove Curtis intentionally killed his wife. Evidence presented to the court included the defendant's previous threats, history of abuse, the victim's cry for help, the defendant's purchase of the freezer and concealment of the body, witness testimony, and the absurdity of the suicide story. The prosecutor argued that the defendant acted with clear motive and calculated to cover up the crime, thus constituting murder with aggravating circumstances. For the defendant, Curtis Holliday hired lawyer Dick DeGuerin, a big name who had defended many difficult criminal cases. Their strategy was to cast doubt on the cause of death. They argued that there was no direct evidence showing Curtis had killed his wife. Lawyer DeGuerin's goal wasn't to prove complete innocence, but to convince some jurors to doubt enough not to convict on the most serious charge, hoping to achieve a plea deal for reduction. And indeed, right before the trial date of June 10, 2024, both sides chose the plea negotiation solution. Curtis Allen Holliday agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a 15-year prison sentence. In return, the prosecution dropped the possibility of prosecuting additional charges and guaranteed not to recommend a higher sentence. On July 19, 2024, Harris County Court held the official sentencing hearing. In the courtroom, Curtis wore an orange prison uniform, his face indifferent. There was no lengthy trial because the defendant had pleaded guilty. The judge confirmed the defendant's agreement to the plea deal, then sentenced him to 15 years in prison. This sentence still seemed too light to many compared to the heinous act. Upon hearing the sentence, some of Lien Chi's relatives and friends burst into angry tears. Outside the hallway, they had hoped the killer would sit in prison for many decades. Lien Chi's family was represented only by Aunt Simon. Simon quietly left the court, refusing to answer interviews, her eyes red. And that's today's case. What do you think about the sentence given to Curtis Allen Holliday? Please share in the comments below. Thank you for following and see you in the next videos.